Stay hungry, stay foolish.
As always, thanks to our friends at Zai. Zai is a global financial services company specializing in foreign exchange and payments and supporting innovation in all its forms. Check them out at hellozai.com. Structural racism has impacted the lives of African Americans in the United States since before the country's founding. Although the country has made some progress toward a more equal society, political developments in the 21st century have shown that deep divides remain. To bridge our divides, our guest, a renowned political scientist, calls for radical empathy, moving beyond an understanding of others' lives and pain to understand the origin of our biases. We welcome the author of Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides, Terri Givens. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's so great to have you on the show, Terri. I was telling you before we came on, I got so much value from it in so many different aspects of my life as a human being, as a parent, as a business person. All those things were so valuable for me. But ultimately, it's the whole idea of making an impact on the planet, and you're definitely doing this. And you begin the book by saying, it's difficult to have empathy in an age of political division, but more than empathy, we require what you call radical empathy. Maybe let's start with sharing what this means versus empathy itself.
When I talk about empathy, it's something that we have to practice, but it's also not enough. So when I was working on this book, I realized, well, I have empathy for other people. You know, I like to be able to, put myself in their shoes and imagine what their life is like. But that's not enough. We have compassion, we have empathy, but things don't change. I guess I saw it in my own neighborhood, in my own life. Well, it's not that people don't care or that they don't have empathy. It's that they have to take action. And so I realized that the bigger problem is that not enough of us take action in our day-to-day lives. And that means thinking about, the others, but also taking action to create change.
And one of the big things you talk about in the book is the idea of connecting with your own story. And this was really impactful on me. You say connecting with our stories is an important step towards developing empathy and demonstrating vulnerability, Terri. And you did this with this book. You shared so many stories and you went on a self-exploration as well. And at a time of great division in your country, you turn your researcher's lens on to your own story and share that story, starting with the story of your late father, Roy. Perhaps we'll share this and what it meant for you to share this story.
My father passed away in 2001, and I opened the book with a story of how we were having a family gathering not long before he passed away, and just kind of the pride he had in his family and so on. And, within a couple of weeks of that family gathering, he died from a heart attack. And so one of the things that I do when this was, of course, a huge impact on my life, and I had a lot of grief and so on. Within a few months, I was like, well, I don't understand. He was only 73 years old. Why did he die from a heart attack so quickly? And so I started doing research into kind of what are the factors that lead to heart attack and risk of heart attack. And I realized one of the top, factors is being an African-American male makes you more susceptible, not only to have a heart attack, but to die from your first heart attack. And that just didn't make sense to me. It just was kind of crazy that the risk factors were so much higher just because you were Black. And so I started doing more research, and that was kind of the genesis of me starting to look more closely into how these structural discrimination, and divides lead to these situations where people aren't even getting the health care they need. And I was able to connect that to my own story. I tell a story. I have a whole chapter on bias in healthcare, and I remember when I was younger, I in my 20s, I was having a lot of issues and found out eventually that I had endometriosis. But I went to doctor after doctor, and finally went to one doctor who said, "Well, I bet you've had a lot of doctors tell you that you couldn't possibly have endometriosis because you're a Black woman. And I was like, well, I've had a lot of doctors who just didn't believe me. And my older sister had endometriosis. And he was like, yeah, unfortunately, we tend to just tell Black women, no, you can't possibly have this. But he believed me, and I got the treatment I needed. And, I really believe he saved my fertility. I was able to have 2 children later on. But those are the kinds of things that you just don't think can possibly happen to you.
I was telling my wife about this, where I was sharing her some of your stories, and she was like, "Oh, when was this written? Is this 50 years ago?" And I was like, "Oh no, this is a brand. Isn't that interesting?" I don't know if you've got that kind of feedback from people. She just didn't understand, because, and this is the point of so many of these issues, is that they're hiding in plain sight. And you say one of the critical issues at the moment in Black communities is the health disparities because of the pandemic, and it's revealed some of those health disparities, that there's a disproportionate amount of the Black community dying because of the pandemic. Maybe we'll share a bit about that, Terri.
Absolutely. I was really shocked. I remember reading news story after news story saying how Black communities, I remember early on in the COVID crisis and the pandemic, communities in Milwaukee were very disproportionately hit by COVID, and a lot of misinformation getting out there, but also fear, because for African Americans, there's always kind of this idea, that that we are targeted in different ways. There's and most of us understand that there was the Tuskegee experiment and so on, that where Black men weren't treated for syphilis for many, long time. And so they could watch, even though once they had treatment available, they'd let these men go through and suffer. And a lot of people know that that wasn't they understand that that was something that they shouldn't be afraid to get health care because of it. But there's just these disparities. I mean, the one of the worst things I read about when doing this research into the medical disparities was that medical students, a very high percentage of medical students believe Black people have thicker skin and therefore we don't feel pain the same way. And there was a lot of concern at the beginning of the pandemic that our government at the time, just didn't care about Black communities and the impact that COVID was having on them. And so just the fact that a lot of these communities don't have access to good medical care, more, in the US, our medical system, it's all based on, for the most part, if you can get insurance through your employer. Of course, we have the Affordable Care Act, but it's still very difficult to have the money to get good health care. And then, of course, you have the bias by the doctors and so on. So the Black communities, not only in the U.S. but around the world, I found plenty of data to show that there were disparities in the impact of COVID.
Yeah, and I'm just going to share, because I shared these stats with my wife, and these are recent stats. So you mentioned multiple studies in the book, like you just mentioned there, about these health disparities. But this one from the National Partnership for Women and Families in the US notes that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience a pregnancy-related death than a white woman. Black women are more likely to experience preventable maternal death compared to white women. Black women's heightened risk of pregnancy-related death spans income and education levels. So it's not about income and education levels. But I found that fascinating that you were saying as well that when a Black woman or man stumbles upon, if they can get access to a Black doctor, their likelihood of getting the correct treatment goes up, which just shows the issues that are hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole issue of maternal and fetal health outcomes was just so shocking to me. I remember I was driving around. I'd been to a meeting in Berkeley or something, and I was listening to our national public radio, and they were saying how the story came on about how Black women, regardless, as you said, of income or education, were more likely to die in childbirth, or have poor fetal health outcomes. And I had already had my two boys, but I was just shocked by that. And it just really struck me that how embedded into the systems that these things are, that it's not just one doctor, or, oh well, if we change, this guy's a racist, if we change his mind, then they'll fix it. No, it's embedded into the systems, and that's why we all have to take responsibility to change it.
You go on to say, for example, in your family, you have experienced lots of health issues, mental health issues as well, which spans across the Black community. And it's no wonder, when I was reading this, I was talking about I was struck by the amount of issues that you have to deal with that, again, are invisible to people of privilege, or people who are fit the system, because the system is so tainted. And one of those terms that you talked about is emotional labor. And this is the term that describes the daily work that people of color do as representatives of race or gender. And you are often expected to manage the expectations and issues that others may have with you, including being the spokesperson for an all Black people when you're in white spaces. There's so much going on here. And I'm sure even coming onto a show like this, there's stuff that you're dealing with that I've no idea that you're dealing with. And that's the point. It can be very emotionally heavy.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting. I was having this discussion with a friend the other day that, I've been in a lot of leadership positions, but, I feel like and again, this is, 21st century. And yet in so many of those leadership positions I've been in, I'm the first Black woman, or the first Black person, or the first woman. And so I spend a lot of time, especially when I'm in universities and so on, often being the only Black person in the room, or the whatever it may be. And it's a burden. And I can't tell you how many times it's like there's a lot of people will make a joke about it. You're the only Black student in the room, or whatever, and something about race or African Americans comes up, and every head in the room turns towards you. And so I do workshops around the book, and I one of the first things I tell people is try not to be that person who is. And I work a lot with my sister, who worked in IBM for over 30 years. And she has so many similar stories, because, here we are, our generation is often, because people are trying to bring more people of color and women into these spaces, we're often the first one or the only one in those spaces. And so, we have this, it's almost like you're constantly on guard. And the other thing I tell people is just in day-to-day life, if I'm going to go into a store or something like that, I may think, okay, well, I have to dress nicely so people think, I'm an okay person and aren't just going to immediately assume something about me. Or, how do I prepare? It's like you have to put on an extra overcoat every time you go outside, because you're going to be, and even if you aren't that day, you just have to be prepared, because you don't want to be caught off guard or have to worry, about how you're going to respond. So it's this extra layer of burden that, you have when you go into these spaces.
And I thought about that for those of our listeners who work in high stress, very stressful roles. It's that multiplied by every experience in life, because it's not just about going to a stressful office environment. It's everywhere. It's in every environment. But there's more. And I thought this term was really important, Terri, and I'd love you to share it. It's the point about internalized oppression. And you say here, oppression is internalized not only by individuals, but also by families and societies. Exploring the impact of this internalization can explain the impact of racism in a way that can lead to a better understanding of the way that bias has become part of our daily lives. You talk about this even as a child growing up, and your parents wanting you to fit into the system and not even having fun, not like you would see children playing in church. That was a no-no for your family, because your mother was carrying this emotional burden all the time.
Absolutely. And, I talk about respectability politics and the fact that we felt like or my mother and father in particular, felt like we had to fit into a certain mold. And so, it's funny. I mean, part of the reason I've done a lot of this work and wrote this book is to understand, the choices that my parents made. And so I mentioned the fact that we grew up in Spokane, Washington, which when I was born in 1964 was less than 1% Black. And, my father was in the military. So this was the last place that he was stationed, at Fairchild Air Force Base. And so that's where they decided to retire, although he spent a couple of years in Michigan in between. But, I always had a hard time understanding, why did you choose, Spokane? It wasn't a horrible place, but, it was actually a nice place to grow up for the most part. But it wasn't, we were far from family and so on. And, I realized over the years that, they understood how important it was going to be for us to be assimilated into white society, that we could function in white society. And, they weren't wrong in many ways. But on the other hand, I felt like a part of myself was oppressed, or just, I couldn't express a part of myself. And because, you mentioned, being in church, I always joke that one of my ideas was to name this book "Growing Up Black and Catholic in Spokane, Washington." Which, it's like, oh, you're already in a town that's less than 1% Black, and then on top of that, you're Catholic. So, we weren't interacting a lot with people who went to the quote unquote Black church. But we did interact with some Black families that my parents thought were okay. But for the most part, they actually did not want us to interact, with a lot of other Black people, and look down on other Black people. And, that had a huge impact on me later on in life, because I felt like there was this cognitive dissonance I was struggling with. It's like, well, on the one, I'm Black, but, you were supposed to act a certain way and be yourself and be confident in who you are. And, that takes me to that learning to love yourself component.
This is really important point. I thought about this. So it's not only your family, for example, were like, we need you to fit into this society, but in a way that meant breaking your way to Spokane. And then on top of that, it was like turning your back on your own background. And this was really difficult for you. And it made you curious about what it meant to be Black in America. And you say that it was clear to you that your Eurocentric school curriculum had left out much of the history that is relevant to your family's history. And you learned nothing about empires in Africa. And that bit you did learn about slavery was carefully whitewashed. That is a really important thing. I thought about that, about how every history is whitewashed in the education system, and that's how people learn about it, and they take it as read that that's actually what happened. And then in 1977, and this is the power of media, a mini-series which I also saw and I thought was so powerful aired, and it was called Roots. And this dispelled many of the romantic notions that many Americans and many people across the world had about slavery. This had a huge impact on you.
It did. It's funny. It was one of those times my parents are like, okay, you can stay up late to watch this and so on. But it really did. I mean, it was the first time I had seen, a portrayal of African Americans, coming from Africa, being enslaved, kind of how the history of that family and so on, and the pride they took in knowing their roots, and so that was one of the first times that I felt, and I still love LeVar Burton to this day for what he did there, but it was one of the first times I really felt like I had a connection to that history. And another book that really had a huge impact on me was one called Homegoing by Ya Gyasi. And that one, again, starts in Africa. And it's the first time since Roots that I read something, and I hope they turn it into a movie someday, but that I felt that connection to Africa. And I've been lucky to have gone to Africa a few times now. And really feeling like, yes, feeling that connection through the centuries back to that history. And we've been denied that history for so long. And in our schooling. And so, I actually have another book coming out called The Roots of Racism in the next month. And that one really digs into the history and, within my own field of political science, how we've been disconnected from understanding how these things have come about.
And I'm so looking forward to sharing that as well when the time comes. But I wanted to lean on to this because it really struck me about that weight of, like, for anybody, for example, the only thing I could relate to here, and I was looking for my own empathy here, and I can't, like, that's the thing, I actually can't get myself into that situation. But the only thing is, I moved up from a small country town up to the city when I was a kid, and oftentimes it was awkward for me to go back and visit the family because it was kind of like, oh no, you're no longer part of the tribe. And I thought about that from your perspective, because you actually went on this mission to find out what it was like, to find out about your family later on in life. And you also had that little bit of a kind of a whiplash of sorts when you did actually do this initially, but they ultimately welcomed you back with open arms.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of it was uh, spending some time, learning about where my mother grew up and was raised, and so on, and actually visiting that place. And I'm the family genealogist, so I've been working on this stuff. Even before I started thinking about this book. Back in the 90s, I was really interested in learning more. And of course, now the tools are so much better. I can find things like my grandfather's draft card and my parents' marriage license. It's all, digitized now. There was always some, tension there about, and it's funny because another book that had a huge impact on me is Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. And she talks about this issue of how, for the older generations, they don't want to talk about, what it was like growing up or any of this history. And for me, it was the same thing with learning about Black history more generally. Even when I was in elementary, I was a huge reader. I read tons of books. And so I would go out and find these books, that I wasn't, learning about, and, who are the Black heroes and so on. And then when I started digging in and doing the genealogy and the research on my family history, it really had a big impact on me to understand, even more recently, I found out that in Opelousas, Louisiana, where my mother was raised in the 1860s, there was this huge massacre. They think over 300 people died, and it was right after the Civil War. And then I started, digging more, and you hear about Rosewood and all these other massacres that happened. And it's mind blowing that this history just isn't out there.
And you found, as you say, on one of those visits, one of those detective visits, that you had a relation, of course you did, that was massacred in one of these despicable trials where they were actually just trying to stand up for rights. And I think it's really important to recognize those people, because they made the ultimate sacrifice for the rest of us going forward. And they're often not recognized because they've gone on to the next place.
Yeah, so there's a really amazing memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, done by Brian Stevenson, who's well known for his work and his writings. It's the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, but also known as the Lynching Memorial. And so it's an outdoor space, and you go in, and there's for each county in the United States where a lynching has occurred, they have a pillar. And so it's very impactful. I encourage people to go to their website and, of course, visit eventually. But, I was just I did this tour of, places in Georgia and Alabama, because I know my father's family came from Georgia, and, there's all kinds of ties in that region. And so my friend, who's a professor at University of Alabama, took me to this national memorial, and I wasn't going there expecting to see, somebody's name that I recognized. I was just curious and wanted to see. Actually, when it first opened, I knew I had to go and see it for some reason. And as we're going through, the thought occurred to me, well, what if I see a name that I recognize? So I looked up in the Louisiana, the counties are called parishes. And so I looked up, where Opelousas was, and it was in St. Landry Parish. And, we hadn't quite gotten to Louisiana yet. And so we get to that pillar and I look and there's the name Julian Stelly. And my mother's maiden name was Stelly. And it just hit me like, this huge wave of just so many different emotions at the same time. And so I looked up Julian Stelling because there are many family members out there have done a lot of the genealogy work. I found he was a very remote cousin, very, very distant, but still, a member of the family. And there was a news article that I found about what happened. And he was basically had been out trying to register people to vote. And the Ku Klux Klansmen came with guns and blazing, and, he was shot and killed.
I just wanted to build on that point about the idea of this monument that was plainly visible, because you had the immense opportunity to visit many times Europe, and you've studied intensively in Europe. You also speak German and French, and you had time to spend there. And where I thought this was really impactful was the chapters you dedicated to those countries that have experienced these difficult pasts, but don't let them just be glossed over. And in the book, you explore ways to find a positive path forward in a country where people can live and work together while acknowledging the impact of the past. And you share how in both Germany and South Africa, change didn't happen quickly. It took time to move past the pain and damage done during times of oppression and violence in these countries. I thought we'd move on to this, Terri, because here's where we can learn from other countries who are still moving on from the past, because as you say, it doesn't happen quickly.
The harm done in South Africa, of course, it was still very apparent when I went to visit there. But it was interesting to see also in Germany, with the Holocaust and the desire to recognize that history and memorialize it in different ways, but also educate about it. I remember when I first went to Germany, and I was staying in at the University of Konstanz in a dorm talking to young people. And they talked about how they felt like they were, constantly being asked to think about, to question everything. And, so of course, Germany went through the Nuremberg trials, right after World War II, but it's been an ongoing process. And I happened to be in Germany in 1995 when there was an exhibit that went around about the Wehrmacht, the German army. And there'd been, even though Germany had been through all of this, there was this kind of, idea that, well, the Wehrmacht, they were okay. It was just the SS and the Nazis that were bad. But this exhibit, was showing how the Wehrmacht was very much engaged in a lot of the atrocities. And so this was like another reckoning for Germany to come to, that no, people want to say, well, my uncle was in the Wehrmacht, but, he wasn't involved in the Holocaust. And it just, it wasn't true. And so, these things made Germany go back and again, reflect on, what had happened and just everyday people who were part of it. And so, I talk about the Stolperstein, those stones that you're supposed to stumble on that, recognize somebody who lived in a home or had a business. And so there's this constant, and, there's, of course, the Holocaust Memorial and many Holocaust memorials. And, I actually have never been able to visit one of the former camps like Auschwitz or anything like that, because for me, just the emotion, because I have so much empathy, I just feel like the emotional pain. But, in South Africa, I did go to Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was held. And that was also a very impactful experience, because one of the guides they use are people who were held there. So it's these kinds of experiences and facing up to the past that I think are so critical. And it's something that we here in the US, we need to have a process of truth and reconciliation that hasn't happened. And, it's interesting now because I'm working at McGill University in Canada, and they're going through a process of truth and reconciliation now with Indigenous communities. And, this is, again, another process that we have to look at and say, look, these crimes were committed, but there's very much still a part of our present day, even though they may have happened 50 years ago. And so I'm watching these processes, and the last chapter of the book is all about truth and reconciliation. And I do believe that having some kind of truth and reconciliation process here in the U.S. would be so helpful to help us get past. And you never can get past it, but to at least acknowledge and understand how to this very day this is impacting every single one of our lives.
I thought about this recently, that if you think about people who were children during the war, during World War II, they're starting to die. They're mostly died out, and when there's no verbal record anymore from somebody to talk about that and talk about the stories and what it was like, or if they're great grandparents now and it's like, oh no, there's your great grandfather Tony over there. He was a kid during the war. He saw the Germans come into his small town in France and walk through the place. They were like machines compared to the French soldiers. Those kind of stories are dying out. And that's why I think this work that you're doing and passing on the record like a baton through the different periods of time is so important. We cannot forget about these things. And I thought this was lovely what you talked about, that the parents in Germany do. So one of the terms that you mentioned there is weiter gut machen, so to make it good again. And I thought about this. I was telling you off air that I work with a lot of financial institutions, and it's a similar process to probably, like you say, what should have happened on a societal scale in the US about slavery and the atrocities that happened. The same thing needs to happen on business processes, where we talk about them, we don't let them happen again, and we can see there's cracks starting to appear again. And one of the key things you mentioned there briefly was that children are encouraged to speak up against authority, to not just assume that just because somebody in a position of authority says something that it's true. And I thought about what an immense impact that has on the society of children, where they start to question, because that is a superpower in this age where we're so divided.
That willingness to question things, and to teach our children, that, not, it's so important, because people talk about, how during these, situations where these atrocities are happening, they're afraid to speak up, or, they don't want to, create waves. But, it's fascinating, because I do see a generation of young people in the US, but not just in the US, around the world, who are stepping up and saying, hey, wait a second. We need to speak up. We need to make sure that we're making companies and adults accountable, because they're looking at a very uncertain future because of climate change. And so it's not just racism and various atrocities. It's their actual future is in doubt. And you look at the Greta Thunbergs and others who are really stepping up, and they need to hold us all to account for the past and the things that have happened. And as you said, the weiter gut machen, we have to really work hard. And corporations, banks, everybody, we all have to take that's why I say it's this individual responsibility, because it's easy to say, oh, well, IBM or that bank over there, they're the bad people, they have to create. No, we're all part of it, and there's ways, and every chapter of the book, at the end of the chapter, there's a series of steps that people can take, because as I said at the beginning, radical empathy is about taking action. It's about actually doing something. And so, it's really critical that people look at those actions and actually get out and do something, versus saying, well, it's up to everybody else, or it's up to these amorphous, people out there, or, the corporations or government. But those institutions are made up of individuals. So every single one of us has to take responsibility and say, we're going to do something about it.
It reminded me of a quote that's always stuck with me by Edmund Burke, I think it was, that all that is required for evil to prosper is good men and women do nothing. And I think that's a great thing to inspire in children, is to actually be able to say that to them. I tell my children about that, like, don't believe everything you say. I lecture also in college, Terry, and one of the first things I tell the children, they're teenagers, they're adults, they're in their 20s. I tell them, just because I'm on the stage here doesn't mean I'm a sage on a stage. I couldn't be wrong. I'm imparting information here. What I want to do is kindle the ideas within you, and you ask questions about them and you build upon them. And I think that's a much better way of passing on the baton of knowledge. So it grows, it evolves over time. But if you will, I'd love to come back, speaking of education, to your experience, because I thought about the different tracks here. So if you think about all the emotional burden that you had to deal with, there was being a woman in leadership position anyway, then there was being a black woman in leadership position, and then there was actually being a pioneer. And as we know, the pioneers take the arrows, and you, I'm sure, have got many arrow scars. And I thought we'd share some of them, because many of our listeners are leaders and they're women leaders, and they experiences some of the things that you experience. And I thought maybe we'd share your experience in academics, because you ploughed your own furrow in academics and you've done extremely well, but it wasn't without its challenges.
Absolutely. You mentioned the slings and arrows. When I left the University of Texas at Austin, I felt like I had knives and swords and all. I felt like I was walking around and my back was clanking because of all the the knives and swords and things I had in my back. But, on the one hand, I feel very lucky because I had some very good mentors who helped me to get into those leadership positions. And people, I say one of the things that was really impactful for me is that throughout my career, I had people who saw more in me than I saw in myself, who could see that I had leadership capacity. And so, early in my academic career, when I moved, I started out at University of Washington, and then we moved to Austin, Texas, and I was at the University of Texas at Austin. And, almost immediately people approached me and said, "Hey, we've been thinking about starting a Center for European Studies. Is this something you'd be interested in working on?" And so I did that and became the director of the center. And then as soon as I got tenure, I always have to tell this story because I still, to this day, find it astonishing. But, when we were having a transition in the administration, and one day the provost called me into his office. It was early in the academic year, and offered me the job of vice provost for undergraduate education. And I tell people I looked in that office for the dent in the floor where my jaw hit. So, because I was so surprised to be offered this very high level position so early in my career. And I did take the job and, did that for 3 years. And it was like drinking from a fire hose because I was new to that level of administration, but also was fairly successful in it. I can go through, I have a long list of accomplishments, including, besides starting the European Studies major, when I was a center director, we started International Relations and Global Studies major. Anyway, we did a lot. And so I took on not only did I do undergraduate education, but I took on the international portfolio as well. But, there were people who didn't like the fact, it's interesting, from one day, to the next, from, being a regular faculty or member and center director to becoming a vice provost, there was a sudden chill, in my department. It's like, oh, Terri's a vice provost now. And, my department chair is like, wow, you outrank me now. And it's like, well, yeah, I guess so. And I did have a lot of support initially in the broader, administration, but, I could see over time that, because I don't have any problem speaking truth to power. My integrity is very important to me. And, I was calling some people out for things they were doing that weren't appropriate. And, there was a lot of, people kind of, I would hear stories, I didn't go to the vice presidential gatherings because I was, that was the provost's job. And, I would hear stories about people saying things about me in these meetings. And so, and the provost was very supportive, of course, but, in particular, some people who were problematic that weren't really doing their job didn't like the fact that I was pointing it out. And, but just in general, there was, the one story I tell is that in the 12 years I was at the University of Texas at Austin, especially when I started out as the vice provost, there were 9 African-American women in leadership positions. And by the time I left, there was 1. And so there was just these pressures and people who, were basically kind of protecting their own fiefdoms and in the process, damaging others. And, I eventually, the main reason I left after 3 years was because I knew I had to get promoted to full professor. But I also just, things at UT just kind of fell apart. I felt like I wasn't getting a lot of the support I needed. And, anyway, I could go on and on. But the main point being that, when I was the first Black woman vice provost at UT Austin, and, it was a position, that people, for the most part, supported, but there was also a lot of people who didn't like the fact that I was, promoted so quickly and so on and so forth. And so it was, it was really hard. And actually, I was by a large amount, the lowest paid of the vice provosts and so on and so forth. It's funny, my assistant, all our salaries are public, and I hadn't looked at our salaries, and my assistant says, "Do you know that you're making like $60,000 a year less than the next lowest paid?" And I'm like, "Wow, I know, I didn't know that." So,
it doesn't make it easier.
No, it doesn't. But it was funny. They right before I started the position, they had just done this, gender equity study, and found that women faculty were massively underpaid compared to male faculty. And of course, we didn't get the endowed chairs and things like that. So yeah, it was very interesting.
Yeah, and that, again, this needs to be shared. This needs to be put out there, and also goes for Black male CEOs. You talked about this, for example, if you look at the companies running, the CEOs running the biggest companies in the world and leading countries, many of them aren't Black males.
For Black women and Black male men, and even when it comes to, I lived in Silicon Valley for many years, and the venture capital just is not flowing. I mean, it's for women, it's like what I think 3% of all venture capital goes to women, and it's like a tiny fraction of that goes to Black women. And so they're doing a lot of work to try to remediate that, but it's impossible for Black women to get venture capital or funding, for their organizations. And then of course the CEO, the top 500 CEOs, there's maybe 1 or 2 Black men or women. I mean, we just haven't made a lot of progress in those areas.
And I guess there's a little bit, Terri, as well, where if you can look, it's kind of like the Roger Bannister effect. The whole idea of if I can see it's possible, I can follow in those footsteps. But then there's also the problem of the history that it hasn't historically happened. So we're in this kind of holding period. And one of the things that often comes up as well, you can't force equality of outcome, but you can force equality of opportunity. And that's actually what we're pushing for here.
Exactly. That, there's so much discussion about, equal opportunity and so on, but we have to be more radical and go beyond that and say, no, we're going to have to lift people up in a way that allows them to even, it's so funny. We talk about an even playing field. Well, we aren't even on the playing field. We're not even close to being on the playing field because of the historical impacts of things like redlining. The easiest thing people can do is just walk around your neighborhood and ask yourself who's not there and why. So I can walk around my neighborhood and say, okay, I don't see very many other Black people or brown people or anybody. Why is that? Because throughout our history, we've had what's called redlining, where these, Black people and people, even Asians in California, couldn't buy homes in particular neighborhoods. And so they didn't get access to the same schools. They didn't get access to the same jobs. They didn't get access to all these things. And it's like, you can't tell people, go pull yourself up by your own bootstraps when there are no bootstraps. They're actually, it's very actively engaged, keeping them out of, the jobs and the homes and the education system. And so, There has to be, I use the word intentional a lot. We have to be intentional. We have to say, we're going to, make this school better. We're going to make sure these kids are, getting food and what they need to thrive. That they're getting the health care that they need, that we're, training doctors to understand the needs of, not only the adults, but the children and so on. And so that's why it's so systemic, right? It's all these things, are playing against what, the outcomes that we want. We say we want these outcomes, and yet, you look at the fact that, schools have been desegregated since theoretically since the 1950s, but if anything, they're becoming more and more segregated because of things like, the housing crises and so on. And, when the financial crisis happened, all these bad loans being made, and of course, people of color were hit by this the hardest, losing their homes in greater numbers. And so, there's just these systemic things we have to look at and say, how do we, start from the ground level and make it a better situation? By the time these kids are in high school or adults, it's too late for many of them. We have to really start when people are young and start with the parents and work on this from, to get rid of systemic discrimination. We have to work at it systematically.
Yeah, and one of the big concerns I have for the future, Terry, as well, to even increase that gap, is automation and artificial intelligence taking jobs, and those first jobs are going to go, or those the bottom rung jobs, which they are, unfortunately, and that's a huge tidal wave that's on its way. But if you would, I'd love to go back in time a little bit to your own experience in school, because one of the things I thought was interesting was this kind of duality that you lived in, that you were aware of yourself being a black woman in academia, but also you made these choices because of the way you were raised to actually almost go, well, I better stick with these people who aren't of the black community, because actually that's what the way I was my parents raised me that way. And an example you give is when you go into the school dorm in Stanford and you have a choice: do I join this black community? Do I sit down with the other black kids and have lunch, or do I not?
Yeah, and there's a famous book, is why do the black kids sit together in the cafeteria? And a lot of it has to do with the structures they need, and and that's a long story. But for me personally, yeah, I arrived at Stanford, and I just didn't have the understanding of how these things had impacted me over time. And I would see the first of all was just choosing a dorm mate. Not that we got to choose, but that you get a little card that you wrote down your interests. This is back in the early 80s, so we didn't have computer matching yet. But one of the questions was, do you want a black roommate? And I was like, well, I don't think I need a black roommate. I'm comfortable being with whoever. And so I didn't check that box, but it was obvious these two girls who lived down the hall from me did. And, not that they didn't interact at all with the rest of us in the dorm, but it was very clear, they were, the two black girls in their dorm room, and they would go hang out with these other black guys and who were roommates across the way. And, they would sit together all the time at lunch and dinner and so on. But I wasn't alone in that. There were several other black students who were in our dorm, and we would just intermix with everybody. But it was hard for me to understand. I was on the track team, and a couple of the guys were also on the track team, and we interacted fine there. But there was still like this barrier. It really hit me my senior year, and I finally started to understand. Yeah, it's okay, because I felt a certain angst or guilt or whatever, and I realized, no, it's okay. You just have to be who you are and just be open to everybody. And no, you don't have to go sit with those other kids. Obviously I didn't, but to take the pressure off of myself and just be who I am.
That really impacted me, that piece. I was just putting myself in your shoes, and I was going to go, wow, like the dilemma of those moments, and yeah, as you said, the angst that's there, it's not quite guilt, but just this constant buzzing fridge in the back of your amygdala, so this kind of idea that it's just draining. It's draining. And as you said, this is one of the reasons you see so many mental health issues in the Black community as well, because you're living with that all the time. But But one of the things you said also there, you mentioned how you did track and you were a highly accomplished athlete, but you didn't go down that track. You did benefit from it, but you didn't actually go down that full scholarship route to become like, an Olympian or anything like that. But you talked about how many of the Black community have that expectation on them and it's their way out. And it's funny, I never thought about the pressure that must put on a community to go, well, not only does this kid have to achieve, but then they actually have to provide for a whole family that haven't made it. It's almost like, one of the horses won the race and that horse can provide for everybody else. And then if they don't make it, the mental issues of that, so the breakdown that people have when they don't, or they get premature injuries, all this must have a huge impact on these families.
There's a lot of investment that's put into often, these kids becoming athletes, and it's not the interesting thing to me is not just in the Black community. I have friends who, spend years in Little League and, hoping their kids will make it into, just to get a college scholarship. And I have friends, I know lots of people whose kids have done that. They went to a better school than they might have or they got a scholarship because, they did well in track. And I did not have a track scholarship. Actually, I was recruited by the coach. So it wasn't that I wasn't recruited, but at that time they just didn't have a lot of scholarships. And so I didn't get one. And actually I was glad that I didn't have a scholarship because it meant I didn't have the, requirement to stay on the team to keep my scholarship. I had a academic scholarship at Stanford, but I noticed that a lot of, people, especially after I got out of college, as they were having their kids, they would put their kids into special and this is another, inequity, right? It's like, you think of the sports that, actually, I can't wait to watch the movie about I think it's King William, about the Williams sisters' father, because, he created a program, that his daughters, were going to be, pro tennis players. And but in any case, there's this real imbalance in terms of, being, I see it, in terms of like just playing soccer. My boys, grew up playing soccer, but, we had to pay for it because it wasn't in the schools and so on. But people really invest a lot of times into sports versus, focusing on education, or they're, not that they don't care about education, they absolutely do. And, they want because you have to get good grades, or at least, be passing your classes to be an athlete, although sometimes that doesn't work as well. But anyway, it's a very complicated situation because, I know my brothers probably weren't pushed as hard in school as they could have been because they were the star athletes. And so oftentimes these star athletes kind of get pushed through school and don't get the education they need to. So there's all these different factors that play into it. But, there's this expectation in certain sports, especially football and, basketball and, other sports where, these kids are seen as having an advantage, or that they're, better athletes. And, track is one of those, especially sprinting and things like that. And so you kind of get put into a box of being better at certain sports. And but yeah, there's like this machine that comes into play that really is pushing these people to be focus on athletics. And but there's no guarantees, right? You can get an injury or anything like that. And so that's why I really, my boys are involved in sports, but that was never the focal point of their lives. They was always, okay, school comes first and sports comes second. And it's about finding that balance and understanding that, very, very few people make it into the NBA or the NFL or, pro baseball, whatever it is. There's got to be a certain balance there, but also it's important that we give opportunity to kids so that they can find, if, maybe tennis is their sport or soccer or whatever it may be. And, especially here in the US, it's become a class related thing. And, of course, class and race are very much intertwined. So a lot of sports, Black kids just don't have access to.
And I thought about that, Terry, from the perspective of say you had a kid who was naturally gifted at sports, but it didn't fulfill them, but they had to kind of go through it. They had this huge expectation, this huge pressure from the family, and that also has its issues as well. I'm sure that's happened to many of the top players out there. But if you were comfortable with it, because you do this in the book brilliantly, sharing the stories, and the stories reveal empathy. I thought about an experience I had. I mentioned to you in my notes that I dated a Black French girl, and it was in the early noughties. And Ireland would see itself as quite a progressive culture, but it definitely wasn't. Because when I went and went for coffee or whatever, for a drink, I would feel people kind of look to one and then the other, and kind of just then almost like look down, and it was like a moment of kind of going, huh, and I was aware of that. And then what it made me aware was, like, if I'm aware of that, she must be aware of that all the time then, and how hurtful that must be to have to, again, wear that emotional burden that I thought you mentioned all the, the different weapons stuck in your back, but it's almost like that of an emotional weight that's weighing you down all the time. And you've experienced this in your own life, because you also have this experience in your life where you dated a white man. You went through this entire experience, and then there's the expectations in your family, his family, etc. Huge emotional burden there.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was growing up in high school, I was one of 9 Black kids in my school. And so when it came to dating, I would just, I loved dances. I would go to all the dances. So sometimes I would just ask a guy, usually a white guy, to go with me. And so when I got into my 20s, I was like, well, I'm going to be like my sisters and just date Black guys. But that didn't go very well. I won't get into all that. I talk about it in the book. But, eventually my now husband and I started dating. And, just we talk about microaggressions. We would be together, and I'll always remember this one. Weren't even married yet, but this guy, a Black guy, walks by and says, God's going to punish you for interracial marriage. And I was just like, oh, well, we're not married. So we were kind of laughing to ourselves. It's like, well, maybe he's probably going to punish us more because we're not even married. But in any case, and just, the seeing the dirty looks and people making comments and so on. And, it's interesting because, we rose above all of that, but that's the thing. It's like, we have to rise above it. It's like, it can't just be a normal boyfriend, girlfriend, right? It's all these, and Mike's parents have always been very nice and kind. But I remember one time there had been a murder of a Black man and a white woman, and they were worried, oh, are you guys going to have issues around that? It's like, well, no, we live in at the time we were in California, and we weren't too worried about it. But and even for my parents were very supportive by that point in time. But I remember when my older sister started dating white men, they weren't happy about that. And by the time I'm the youngest of 7. So by the time I came along, I was like, okay, it's okay if you date whoever you want, but just, as long as you're happy. And, there's, interracial marriage. I have a whole set of statistics about that in the book, because it's still, very difficult, and people, look askance at interracial marriages and so on. And, it's becoming more common, but, it's such a complicated issue, for Black women, and, being the rate of marriage and so on. It's just really frustrating to see that these issues are still out there.
And then, as you say in the book as well, then you have to make your children aware of that this is society. Society isn't equal in this respect, and they need to understand this, because they're going to be born into this, and they're going to experience it, and they're going to experience certain issues over their lifetime as well. So you have to deal with that as well.
Yeah. But also setting an example for them. and, making sure they understood, it doesn't matter, you actually trying to pass on, the wisdom I gained over the years so that they didn't feel these tensions. And unfortunately that, they still do to a certain extent. I remember having a discussion with my son when he started high school and, how he felt like he didn't understand the jokes some of the kids from another part of town were making and so on. I said, well, look, that's normal, right? You live in a very different part of town than they do, and they've grown up together, and you're new. We had just moved to the San Francisco area from Texas, and so helping him understand. But we end up talking a lot about, they still deal with a lot of microaggressions with their friends and things like that, and so we talk about it, and then of course there's the talk that Black parents have to give to their young men, which is especially children in general, about the police, right? That if you ever get pulled over by the police, don't fight back, just make sure you have your hands on the wheel and they can see you, and it's just, and actually there's another story I tell about, just my boys, they were typical boys. They wanted to play guns when they were growing up, and I said no, because I don't trust you. You can't run around with those. So one day my husband took them to the sporting goods store to get shoes or something, and they talked him into getting this play rifle. And I had the orange tip and everything. And I said, okay, you cannot play, you can play with it in the backyard, but you cannot be anywhere in public with this. And not long after that, Tammy Rice, who was, 12 years old, was in the park playing with a toy gun and didn't even get a chance, was shot by the police. And, I had to say, look, I'm sorry. This is why I told you, you cannot go in the front yard and play with this gun. And actually that gun eventually disappeared. Because this is what happens. And I can't be assured that, the police in this, Austin, Texas are going to look at that and see it as a real, anyway. I mean, it doesn't matter. It can be a cell phone. It can be anything. And they see it in your hand and, you're shot and dead. So, that was really hard as well.
At the end of each chapter, the book is brilliantly written. It shares exercises that we can all take, and the first step we can take is with ourselves. And I just wanted to share, Terri, I'm not sure if I know you love France and you love traveling around France. There's a beautiful quote by French essayist, novelist and critic Marcel Proust, and it goes as follows: "The only true voyage of discovery would be not to visit strange lands, but to possess others' eyes, to behold the universe through the eyes of another, of 100 others, to behold the 100 universes that each of them beholds. That is each of them." I thought that was a beautiful quote to bring to life the idea of empathy and trying the very best you can to see it the way the other person can, which is so difficult. But you tell us getting to radical empathy is a path that you have separated into 6 distinct steps. I thought we'd share this as a final message to our audience.
As I was thinking through what radical empathy meant to me, I kind of went through my own process of discovery. And the first was that willingness to be vulnerable, because in being vulnerable, I was able to look at my family history and the way I was raised and so on, that helped me connect more to my parents and to be more compassionate and understanding about what they had gone through in their lives and the way they had raised us. And then that second step is becoming grounded in who you are. Because as I mentioned, going through college, by the time I got to my senior year, I was like, oh yeah, I can just be who I am. I don't have to meet the expectations of the Black kids sitting at the table, or, the white kids sitting over here. I can be who I am. And so once I became grounded in who I was, then I just felt so much more freedom just to be who I am in the world. But that also allowed me to be open to the experiences of others. So by understanding who I am and, learning to love myself, there's that great Whitney Houston song, the greatest love of all. It actually allowed me to be open to others' experiences. And I also believe that if you love yourself, it's much easier to love somebody else, because you have to know that you are capable of being loved and loving others. And so opening yourself up to the experiences of others is really critical in this, because that's where you start to practice empathy. And of course, practicing empathy is the next step. because empathy comes natural to some of us, but not to others. And even for me, I feel like I've always had a lot of empathy, but I have to practice all the time. I am not, above, having issues with, putting myself in somebody else's shoes, but you have to go beyond just putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. You have to be willing to take action. And so, and like you said, every chapter of the book has actions that you can take. And then step 6 is creating change and building trust. And that's where that chapter on truth and reconciliation comes in, talking about ways we can create change that starts, in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces and so on, but builds out to our broader societies and says we have to create change in order for everybody to have opportunity and to be in a position to, have, a good life in the end.
I love that you mentioned Whitney Houston. I always think about the groundbreaking work she did, and it's no wonder she had problems, because the amount of burden that she would have had to carry that none of us will ever know, because she held it to herself as well, is just incredible. But Terri, I've pulled a beautiful final quote from the book to share. But before I share that, I wondered, where can people find out more about your book, about this book, about your future books, about your writings? Where can they find you?
I'm pretty much everywhere, but if you Google Terri Givens, you'll find me. But if you go to terrigivens.com, I have a page on radical empathy, and I need to get it in gear and create a new page for the book that's coming out next month, The Roots of Racism. I have my faculty page at McGill. And so there's I have various pages if you just Google and search, but terrigivens.com is the main one. And then I have my company as well, Brighter Professional Development, where we are offering workshops, and they're very customized. We've worked with several organizations over the years. I've done talks for Salesforce.org and Salesforce.com as well. I've worked with various companies and many institutions of higher education. I'm being asked to do talks all the time. And actually, I got to get my act together and make sure I've got my schedule for the spring all lined up. But I'm out there and on social media, Twitter at Terri Givens and Facebook and so on. So LinkedIn is a really good place to connect.
Brilliant, Terri. Well, I'll share that, and it's Terri with an I. So just for those people, and I will share where to find you. I'm going to quote this, and then I'll ask you maybe to close today's show with your message for our audience. That is a global audience, Terri. So the quote I picked first is a quote that you share from Nelson Mandela, because his words inspired you to focus on the idea of empathy as a way to do this work to appeal to all who have a willingness to remake any country, including your country, America. He said, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught how to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than it is the opposite." Then your words resonated even further, which came after that, and you said, "We may not agree with our neighbour, but you hope our love for our communities can help us find a path to move past hate. We must start using our tools and techniques, like those described in this book, to create hope and energize us for the long haul of healing the racial divisions in our societies. There is no miracle cure, and a new leader can change the tone, but it will take all of us working together to shift the tide. Each of us has the capacity to implement these strategies at every level. It can be a conversation with your neighbour, in the workplace, or in your local cafe. These tools are applicable everywhere." What about you, Terri? What's your final message for our audience today?
One thing we haven't talked about is just this idea of having courage, because, we mentioned fear. I mean, a lot of times we're afraid to take that action for whatever reason it may be. And I often see this happening in these workshops when mostly, maybe a group of white people I'm talking to, and they might have one or two Black colleagues in the room, and they're literally afraid to speak up because they're afraid of making mistakes. So the one thing I will say is that you have to have the courage. Maybe you will make mistakes at the beginning, but have the courage to make those mistakes and learn from them, right? Every single one of us makes mistakes. So if you get paralyzed with fear, then you're just not going to take any action. So it's really important that we understand that you have to have that courage to make mistakes, because we all learn from them.
Beautiful way to finish today's show. Author of Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides, Terri Givens. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And as always, thanks to our friends at Zai, a global fintech innovating within their area of expertise, friends of the show. By supporting them, you're supporting us. Check them out at hellozai.com.